In our headlines on this Wednesday afternoon, May 31st. North Korea fails to launch into space its first spy satellite early this morning and vows a second attempt in the near future, while South Korea denounces the attempts as grave violations of UN Security Council resolutions. And the international community raises much concern over North Korea's latest launch, underscoring its disruption of regional stability and its rampant violation of UN resolutions. Meanwhile, South Korea's team of experts say further analysis is necessary to verify the safety of Japan's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean starting this summer. We start here on the Korean Peninsula with news of North Korea's failed attempt to place its first spy satellite into orbit. South Korea, for its part, has strongly condemned the latest launch. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Kim Hyun-sung reports.
North Korea launched a rocket carrying a satellite on Wednesday, according to South Korean military sources.
Our military detected what North Korea claimed to be a space launch vehicle traveling in a southward direction from the area of Dongchang-ri in North Pyongan province at around 6:29 a.m.
The launch, North Korea's seventh attempt at launching a satellite, but the first in over 7 years, has escalated regional tensions. Military analysis says the rocket fell into the West Sea around 200 kilometers west of South Korea's Ochongdo Island. Military authorities on Wednesday morning said they are currently recovering what appears to be debris from the West Sea for further examination. However, according to North Korean state media, the Korean Central News Agency, the rocket launch was a failure. It reported that the projectile dropped into the West Sea after losing momentum due to an abnormal flight. The botched launch did rattle South Korea, however. On Paekmyeongdo Island, an island off South Korea's west coast and located below the rocket's flight path, residents were quickly ushered into shelters as public speakers blasted out warnings for a solid 20 minutes. The launch also prompted officials to send emergency evacuation messages through text and public speakers all over the capital city, Seoul, as they initially thought that debris may fall from the sky. The government has since withdrawn the warning, assuring citizens that the failed rocket launch does not pose a risk. North Korea had previously notified the International Maritime Organization of its intent to launch the reconnaissance satellite between May 31st and June 11th, adhering to their schedule with this recent launch. The KCNA said that North Korea is currently analyzing what went wrong and would launch another rocket in the near future. The situation triggered an emergency meeting of the National Security Council's Standing Committee, led by National Security Advisor Cho Tae-yong, to address North Korea's long-range ballistic missile launch under the pretext of a so-called satellite, as stated in an official release. The National Security Council has decried the rocket launch as a severe breach of UN Security Council resolutions and a potent provocation that threatens peace not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also potentially extending to a wider region. These comments were echoed by the presidential office in an official statement issued on Wednesday. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
And in related news, South Korea's allies, including neighboring Japan and the US, were quick to denounce North Korea's rocket launch. Our foreign affairs correspondent Pei Eun-ji covers their response.
After North Korea launched what it claimed was a space launch vehicle, Japan briefly issued a rare emergency alert for Okinawa, urging residents to immediately take shelter inside a building or underground. The warning, issued at around 6:30 a.m., was lifted around 30 minutes later, after Japan's Coast Guard said the projectile was believed to have fallen into the sea.
Due to the possibility that it could fall inside or fly over our country's territory, a J alert was swiftly enacted and information shared with the public.
The Japanese government spokesperson also said Japan has lodged a complaint against North Korea through diplomatic channels in Beijing. He added that Pyongyang's continued actions threaten the safety and security of the country and the international community. Following the launch, the White House also said that it condemned the North Korean space launch, which it says uses ballistic missile technology. White House National Security Council spokesperson Adam Hodge said in a statement that U.S. President Joe Biden and his national security team are assessing the situation in close coordination with their allies and partners. Meanwhile, the United Nations also warned North Korea that any launch using ballistic missile technology would violate UN Security Council resolutions. In the statement, the UN urged Pyongyang to resume diplomatic efforts towards sustainable peace and complete and verifiable denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. 배은지, Arirang News.
So, what are the broader implications of North Korea's space ambitions at this particular point in time? Our Lee Kyung-eun answers that question.
Launching its first reconnaissance satellite is key to North Korea's 5-year military advancement plan rolled out in 2021 with the aim of having it ready by April this year. Sending a satellite into orbit requires a long-range space rocket. While space development is an open race for many countries, this is not the case for North Korea. Because the required rocket involves long-range missile technology and the regime is banned from using it under UN Security Council resolutions, regardless of the purpose. Despite warnings from the international community, North Korea has been accelerating its militarization of space. Earlier in May, leader Kim Jong-un inspected the satellite and gave the go-ahead for quote future action plan, with the launch date finalized to be between May 31st and June 11th. Affecting the timing, the weather factors to avoid seasonal monsoon rains or typhoons, but also the North's competitive spirit against the South.
North Korea desperately wants to be ahead of South Korea when it comes to satellite launch capability. And South Korea just put a satellite, 7 of them in fact, into orbit about a week ago.
But at the core of Pyongyang's planning is the military component. Since 1998, North Korea has attempted 6 satellite launches. Just 2 entered orbit, only to fail to communicate with the ground. If this one succeeds, the regime could ramp up its monitoring and precision strike capability against South Korea and the U.S. But experts say there's only so much it could do with that one satellite in its early stage of development.
The satellite seems to be capable of creating only low-resolution images, which will be difficult to identify in the case of rain or darkness. The regime also lacks expertise and infrastructure to analyze the received data.
Plus, more than one satellite is needed to create a comprehensive image of a target. That said, experts say this launch could pave the way for more to come, at which point the North could expand its data analysis and advance the capability of its satellites. Young-eun, Arirang News.
A UN committee has highlighted the dire plight of North Korean female defectors in China, where they reportedly face human trafficking. Our Isingjae's details.
The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women released a report on Tuesday after a review of women's rights in China. The report pointed out the human rights violations that North Korean women refugees face, including human trafficking and forced marriages. The UN organization called on China to not repatriate any North Korean refugees who defect from the North, as North Korean women are being deprived of their rights to give birth because children born in China cannot register their birth locally without exposing the mother to the risk of being deported to North Korea. It also called for North Korean women and girls who have been victims of human trafficking to be given basic social services, such as temporary residence permits, medical and education services, alternative income opportunities, and rehabilitation programs without being punished for violating immigration laws. In response to the report, China did not acknowledge the issue of human rights violations, stating that most of the North Korean women who come to China come to make money, and it's difficult to consider that as human trafficking. The United Nations defines human trafficking as not only the buying and selling of people as goods, but also the act of taking people under the pretext of employment and preventing them from moving freely by exploiting their vulnerable position. The latest CEDAW report marks the first time the UN organization publicized the human rights issue of North Korean refugee women through a human rights review targeting China and not North Korea. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
In Jeju Island, defense authorities are hosting an anti-proliferation maritime exercise with the US, Japan and Australia on this Wednesday. The exercise has been scaled back owing to adverse weather conditions, and it comes as part of the Proliferation Security Initiative that kicked off on Tuesday to curb the spread of weapons of mass destruction. The exercise involves maritime interception and seizure operations, as well as the operation of vessels on a command post exercise using computer simulations. This time, only the South Korean Navy and Coast Guard ships are anchoring at the Jeju Civil Military Complex port for on-site training such as boarding and inspection. Korea's inaugural summit with Pacific Island nations earlier this week sought to set the bilateral framework for stability, that is, and prosperity in the Pacific region. That being said, our top office correspondent Oh Soo-young covers the response of pundits here regarding the government's efforts.
South Korea is stepping up as a stabilizing force for peace and development, establishing stronger relations with Pacific Island countries amid compounding threats to a free and rules-based order in the region. Alongside Seoul's first ever multilateral summit with all 18 leaders of the Pacific Island Forum nations, President Yoon Suk-yeol held separate meetings with 10 heads of government. Their talks focused on climate, healthcare, infrastructure and development assistance as key areas of cooperation, as extreme climate events threaten the health of Pacific Islanders and their economic and social development. Yoon's engagement with the islands is in line with this Indo-Pacific strategy.
I think it reflects the more values-based agenda that the Yoon administration is trying to pursue to preserve a free and open regional order, and such as hosting the Summit for Democracy this year, and now with the Pacific Islands leaders visiting Korea for the first time. It's to show that Korea can step up and play a more active role in providing regional public goods.
Preserving a free and liberal order in the region and protecting maritime routes is vital to Seoul's national and economic security interests as it seeks multilateral efforts to deter a nuclear North Korea and bolster trade relations as a heavily export-dependent nation. This calls for more expansive partnerships.
The Pacific Island nations are obviously very strategically important, both geographically and in the context of their representation in the United Nations. I think it's very important that the Western allies combine to help these island nations. And I think sometimes that it's a little bit risky for those island nations to be seen as being too dependent on aid from the United States.
With the US and China vying for influence over Indo-Pacific countries, South Korea is being welcomed as a balanced partner to the islands and other neighbours in the region.
Middle powers have limited resources. And if you have limited resources, the more you do, the less effectively you do each item. And the Pacific region has always come last in South Korea's diplomatic efforts. I'm hoping what we're seeing here is the first step in bringing the Pacific region up to a higher level in Korea's diplomacy.
But leveraging its engagement for middle power diplomacy will take long-term and consistent effort as Seoul itself continues to juggle with the ever-changing and ever-complex dynamics of geopolitics. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
South Korea's team of experts who were recently in Japan for an on-site survey of facilities in Fukushima say further analysis is needed, that is, to verify the safety of Tokyo's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean starting this summer. Speaking at a briefing here on this Wednesday, the head of the team, Yugo Ki, said, while meaningful progress had been made in terms of a scientific and technological review of the relevant facilities, more analysis is necessary for an accurate assessment of the facility's performance adequacy and potential for long-term operation. That being said, you added plans for additional efforts on the matter with Japanese authorities. In other news, the latest monthly figures for Korea's economy show industrial activity and retail sales losing ground. Our Lee Soo-jin has more.
South Korea's industrial production fell in April. Data released by Statistics Korea shows that last month's industrial production was down 1.4% compared to the month before. It had risen in the 2 previous months, and the fall in April was the biggest on-month drop in 14 months. Statistics Korea attributed the decline to lower production in the manufacturing and services sector.
The overall industrial production fell compared to the previous month due to a drop in production in the mining and manufacturing and the services industries.
Production in mining and manufacturing industries fell by a combined 1.2% compared to the previous month, amid a drop of almost 7% in the production of machinery, such as semiconductor equipment. A drop in exports of chips and chemical products caused the manufacturing industry's inventory to shipment ratio to jump by 13.2 percentage points on month to hit 130.4%, the highest rate on record. Production in service industries also fell by 0.3%, mainly due to a drop in the wholesale and retail sectors. Retail sales, a gauge of consumer demand, were down 2.3% compared to the previous month, largely due to the drop in clothing sales led by the base effect of February's spike in clothing demand.
Retail sales were also down from the previous month as sales of apparel, food, and groceries dropped.
That's the second consecutive month that retail sales saw an on-month decline and the largest drop since November last year. Facility investment, however, edged up slightly 0.9% from a month earlier on increased investment in transportation equipment such as airplanes. The Finance Ministry announced on the same day that it will focus on revitalizing the nation's exports, investments, and domestic demand through measures that include monitoring overseas and domestic markets in real time. 이수진, Arirang News.
On a light note now, K-pop superstar BTS marks its 10th anniversary this year, and in light of this event, the group is collaborating with the capital city in hosting the 2023 BTS Festa starting today until mid-June. The festa includes celebrations and related activities at landmarks across Seoul with City Hall, Namsan Tower, Dongdaemun Design Plaza, and the World Cup Bridge lit up in purple, the BTS color. Yeouido Hangang Park will bring the festa to a close on the 17th of June with a grand display of fireworks. Technology transfer in the context of the space industry here is expected to promote commercial activity, boost economic growth, and enhance opportunities for greater success up ahead, especially amid Nuri's successful third launch. Our business correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
Behind the successful launch of Nuri is the participation of Hanwha Aerospace, which became the first private company to take part in the project. The involvement comes as space industries in other countries are ready to enter the so-called new space era, led by private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin.
The country is now transferring technology to the private sector and letting it supervise the integration of such launch vehicles. This is because when the domestic industry weakens, it is difficult for even the national-led space development to progress.
3 more launches of the Nuri rocket will be carried out between now and 2027, with Hanwha Aerospace taking charge. Throughout the process, private firms will take on the responsibility of manufacturing the Korean space launch vehicles while aiming to improve their manufacturing skills. Following the third launch of Nuri, South Korea's space industry as well as other industries are expected to see growth.
The aerospace industry encompasses all industries related to space exploration, such as the construction and operation of launch vehicles and satellites, as well as the development and supply of satellite services, therefore having significant added economic value.
As seen in the war in Ukraine, in emergency situations, satellite communication, such as that provided by SpaceX's Starlink satellite internet service, is important. In fact, the South Korean government is planning to launch 80 satellites by 2030. With increasing demand for satellites, semiconductor and communication service sectors are expected to grow, along with advancements in technologies for monitoring climate and observing terrain. Based on a forecast of the global market reaching $1 trillion by 2040, the government hopes to expand South Korea's share in the global space market to 10% by 2045. Starting this year, the government is planning to invest 2 trillion won or roughly $1.5 billion in developing a next-generation launch vehicle that is even more advanced than Nuri. It'll be used to launch a lunar lander in 2032. The Yoon administration is also working on establishing a National Aeronautics Administration, or a Korean version of NASA, in order to lead the country's space economy. 신하영, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Russia, drone attacks on Tuesday local time hit buildings in the capital, Moscow. According to reports, the attacks injured 2 people and damaged at least 3 residential buildings. Russia has blamed Ukraine for the strikes. President Vladimir Putin said the attack was an attempt by Ukraine to frighten Russians. He added that it is a clear sign of terrorist activity. But Ukraine has denied any involvement. For its part, Ukraine has been hit by 17 airstrikes this month, including one on the capital of Kyiv on Monday, which killed at least 1 person. Disgraced Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes has begun her 11-year prison sentence. Holmes on Tuesday local time entered a federal Texas prison after her request to remain free on bail while appealing her conviction was rejected. The 39-year-old was convicted on 4 felony counts of fraud and conspiracy in January last year. This because she falsely claimed her company had technology capable of detecting conditions such as diabetes using just a few drops of blood. The hype saw Theranos raise billions in funding from investors. But the technology never worked, and the Silicon Valley-based company closed its doors in 2018. Earlier this month, a U.S. judge also ordered that Holmes and her ex-partner Ramesh Balwani pay $452 million to the victims. Shifting to the tech space, dozens of AI experts and tech leaders, including the heads of OpenAI and Google DeepMind, have warned that artificial intelligence could lead to humanity's extinction. According to a statement published by the Center for AI Safety on Tuesday, the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority and needs to be reduced. The statement also outlined ways that AI could threaten humanity, including weaponizing AI to make chemical weapons and destabilizing society through generated misinformation. But other experts say fears of extinction due to AI are overblown and unrealistic. And finally, the world's only known white panda has been caught on camera. The bear was spotted in China's Sichuan province in the Wolong National Nature Reserve. Footage shows the bear approaching a calm mother panda and her cub, whom experts believe may be part of its family. The white panda was first discovered in April 2019. Experts have concluded that it is an albino due to its red eyes and lack of black spots. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It looks to be a repeat of yesterday's weather conditions under brighter skies. Western parts of the country are seeing another big hike in the afternoon highs. East Coast regions are having breezier afternoon again, but southeast regions, including Daegu, should notice warmer highs compared to yesterday. Now, skies are much sunnier today. Other than the capital region, most parts will be under lots of sunshine all through the afternoon, boosting UV rays to very high levels during the day. Meanwhile, Jeju Island is forecast to see 5 to 20 millimeters of more rain this afternoon with breezy afternoon highs. The rest of the country is having highs that are 2 to 4 degrees higher today. The air quality will be normal to good nationwide all day. Now, those in the south need to brace for another band of rain that's in the forecast from Jeju and the south coast tomorrow morning, which will expand to the rest of the southern regions by the afternoon and possibly continue into Friday morning. Now, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Well, those are the headlines at this hour, but we have our panel session coming up right after this break, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.
Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. Are you excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
South Korea's successful space launch last week is followed by a similar attempt by North Korea on this Wednesday that reportedly ends in failure and a pledge for another attempt in the near future. So what is the latest regarding North Korea's most recent violation of UN resolutions? What has been the foreign media response to South Korea's successful space launch? And what is the fate of the Korean man who opened the door of the plane mid-air?
Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we bring you our weekly check on stories here that made headlines elsewhere as well. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca here in the studio with me. Thomas, it's good to have you back.
Thanks, as always.
I also have Melanie Jensen with us. Melanie, welcome back.
Thank you.
Right, Thomas, let's start with you then. North Korea's space launch, attempt to launch into space its satellite was a failure today. It was covered by the foreign media as well. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, at the very start, the first sort of headline that a lot of foreign media jumped on was the fact that there was an emergency evacuation notice that was sent out in Seoul, which I've never experienced. I think most of the people that have lived here a while have never had that experience. So that was kind of, a twist on these launches have become in some ways background noise. There's been so many of them, so that for a few moments was kind of
unsettling.
Unsettling and sort of cast it in a more urgent light, perhaps. So, there was a little bit about that factor initially, and then, right, of course, afterwards, it was just sort of following up on what was launched. What do we know about it? And North Korea had already announced that it planned to launch a military reconnaissance satellite. They announced earlier this week. So, this was obviously that attempt, and as we've been following along, it failed. North Korea even admitted that it failed, and it splashed down in the Yellow Sea. One interesting factor is, I guess, the South Korean military has recovered, has salvaged some pieces from this. So this might be a little bit of a sign as to, where is North Korea's technology as regards this? Because, there have been a lot of questions. Is North Korea capable of, putting a satellite into orbit? Do they have the kind of reconnaissance technology that they've been talking about? So this, may or may not be a clue to that. Yeah, I think it's sort of, again, now at a wait and see moment. North Korea has already said they plan to launch again. So, that's sort of where we are.
Right, a second attempt in the near future. Melanie, staying here on the Korean Peninsula, South Korea's space launch, Nuri's third launch into space, was a success. It was covered, of course, last week. I understand it was also covered by the foreign media. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So the foreign media regarded this space launch as rather a success. Several media dubbed it as called it a breakthrough in Korea's attempt to make a space race in Asia. Yeah, it was definitely seen as a great success, and I think, especially in the recent light with North Korea, with that issue of their failed launch, it will be seen as an even greater success that South Korea actually managed to get a satellite into orbit. So it's also been a success compared to, for example, Europe, where a Danish astronaut just last week was calling for Europe to be more aware of their space technology and actually getting more into the game, along with, for example, South Korea or the United States. Previously, Europe has mainly had a space success in regard to Russia during the Cold War. But now it seems like Europe is not really trying that hard, especially compared to, well, for example, both of the two Koreas.
Is there a lot of, would you say, public support for space exploration in Denmark? Keeping in mind the comments by this Danish astronaut who said that Europe is falling behind with regard to the race to space.
Well, no, I wouldn't say so, actually. If you look at the bigger... Well, if you look at how many people, for example, in the United States who are interested in space technology and who are supporting making more, like sending more things into space and making more rockets and stuff like that, I would say that the Danish people are not against space technology, but Denmark is a very small country and space equipment and space research is very, very expensive. And I think it requires a bigger economy than we can muster in Denmark to even reach the needs of countries like South Korea or the United States.
Right, I see. Thomas, also in the air, but on a more alarming note, there was a story about a man who opened the door of a plane in mid-air. This was covered quite a bit here on the local front, of course, as well as abroad. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, I think, you know, airplane incidents often get a lot of coverage internationally, and certainly the videos that emerged from the cabin itself were just so compelling, you know, first on social media, and then it was definitely picked up all over the world. I mean, it was shocking and sort of terrifying to see, and I think everybody has a, you know, a visceral reaction to seeing something like that. You know, the follow-up has been just sort of what we're hearing from the police reporting to local media. I mean, the suspect was a 33-year-old man that was arrested, and police have said that he was undergoing some kind of psychological or mental issues at the time, and I think told them that he had just lost his job and said that he was feeling suffocated and wanted to get out the door. And this was as the plane was on its approach. It was like, you know, a little more than 200 meters in the air approaching Daegu. You know, authorities have said, though, that it would be impossible to open the door at a higher altitude. The pressure would be much higher. So, you know, it was at a relatively low altitude, and, you know, no one was injured. About a dozen people were taken to the hospital. And so the suspect is potentially can see up to 10 years in prison for violating, there's an aviation security law. And, you know, in response, Asiana and I think a couple other airlines have jumped on as well, have stopped selling those seats that are right next to the emergency exit on certain planes, like the one this guy was on was an Airbus A321, which, you know, I think is just a little bit of a maybe reassurance kind of gesture to passengers for the near term. I mean, there's no real sense of how long that will last, but yeah, so it was certainly you know, a widely covered story, though, around the world.
Right, it really was, it really was. Meanwhile, Melanie, here in South Korea, again, the Disaster Control Center, it held its last meeting with regard to COVID-19, as tomorrow, that is the start of June, the country Korea lowers its alert level for COVID-19. Now, this was the center's 691st meeting ever since the start of the pandemic, of course. All that being said, Melanie, what marks would you grant South Korea for its management of the pandemic?
Well, I think Korea's worldwide legacy will still be how well Korea managed the pandemic, especially in the beginning when COVID broke out. Korea really was seen as this role model country, and I think almost no matter what happens, Korea will never be forgotten for that. Especially, I know in Europe, Korea is really remembered as this kind of model country in controlling the pandemic. However, I also know that there have been quite a few more critical articles during the end of the pandemic in 2021, 2022, criticizing Korea for being a bit too precautious, taking a bit too long in, for example, removing the regulations regarding masks, or removing like the regulations regarding not being able to go out at night and those kind of things. But despite that, if you look at how well Korea managed to get out of the pandemic, in contrast to, for example, United States, Italy, India, Korea will definitely be a success story in regard to the COVID pandemic.
You're right, and hopefully we won't have another pandemic in the near future. Moving forward, Melanie, the BBC, it featured an extensive piece on Korea trying to coax its young recluses to venture outdoors. Do tell us more about that.
Yes, so in South Korea, there is approximately 340,000 young Koreans who refuse to leave their home. And these types of people are being called hikikomori, which is a Japanese term for people being afraid of going out. This number has been on the rise ever since COVID, and it is unfortunately a trend we see worldwide. We see it in Japan, we see it in Korea, we also see it in Denmark, for example, in Europe, in the United States. But it seems to be especially severe in East Asia. And Korea's response in trying to get these young people to leave their home have been giving them more money, giving them this kind of state monthly supplement. However, people actually working with the hikikomori, they are saying that they are not really sure that money is the right way to make young people leave their homes, because it is rarely financial issues that keep people indoor. It is the pressure of being in society, the pressure of conforming into specific types of jobs, of education, of going into this everyday treadmill, you could say, that makes many young people afraid that they cannot find and get the same success as, for example, their classmates, their co-workers. And this fright is what is keeping them indoor. So money will probably not give them enough help to actually give them the courage to go out.
Right, and staying with that, Thomas, how do you explain the prevalence of this unfortunate reality, which Melanie has pointed out is not purely a Korean phenomenon?
No, not at all. As she said, the term for it is hikikomori, which originated in Japan in the 90s, and it's been a phenomenon there. And I think it's some of the shared social conditions that Japan and South Korea have that, is seen as driving it, perhaps its greater prevalence here. Again, as Melanie mentioned, there's an incredible amount of pressure in, just from the school environment onwards. I think a lot of us have covered the, annual Sunung, entrance exams, and I think there's that feeling of, you have to get on a track at a certain point and stay on it, or you'll be lost. And so a lot of young people are responding to that feeling of just intense pressure, intense competition, which I think is also magnified by the realization that, perhaps the explosive economic growth that previous generations could at least look towards as saying, okay, this is, making all of this endless work, there's a end in sight. I think a lot of younger people are clearly seeing that their job prospects don't necessarily look as hopeful. There's been youth unemployment or underemployment issues for a long time. We're seeing that reflected in the low birth rates in South Korea, high rental prices. I mean, there's a whole sort of menu of social conditions that are exacerbating this. And another thing that people have pointed to, which also Japan shares, is a culture of bullying in high schools. Which has emerged globally with the Glory, this Netflix series, and it's Hakpok, I guess it's called. And there's almost a Me Too movement of that happening in South Korea, about people reflecting on that. But yeah, and it's also more East Asia wide. It does seem China shares some of these same conditions as well. There's a phenomenon they call lying flat there, which is not necessarily, some of it I think is recluse behavior. Some of it is just people kind of giving up a bit of not trying as hard, not getting into this real sense of the rat race for the same basic conditions. And yeah, it does extend to other countries as well. I mean, certainly there are these types of recluses in the U.S. And there's also, these more subtle phenomenons that share some of the same characteristics. I mean, there's a term that was called quiet quitting in the U.S. that kind of emerged during the pandemic. I think that also shined a light on some of these issues that, made people start to question their work-life balance, where it's not necessarily people not leaving their homes, but just kind of realizing I don't want to give all of my time, all of my energy to a job that doesn't necessarily, have my interests in mind. So there's, that global shift is happening in a lot of cases, but I think Korea is seeing maybe the most intense, factors coming together to really make it a significant issue at this moment.
Right, unfortunately, of course. On a light note then, Melanie, aside from the 7 Korean productions that were invited to screen at the Cannes International Film Festival this year, I believe a K-pop group made history there. Tell us about that, please.
Yes, it is a K-pop girl group aespa who made their first appearance on the Cannes Festival, and it is the first time that a K-pop group, where all the group members are on the red carpet at the same time in the Cannes Film Festival. So it has been seen as some kind of K-pop success story, and a lot of aespa's fans have been really, really happy to see them there. And they have received so much support, and it has been seen as a great success for the group, and aespa is already known to be a K-pop success group. The reason that they were attending the film festival is because they're doing a collaboration with the Swiss jeweler Chopin, and that jeweler had invited them to be on the red carpet.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Thomas, on a more somber note then, Bloomberg, it claims that Korea will not cash in on Beijing's ban on US chipmaker Micron. Could you tell us about that particular report and its broader implications, of course?
Right, well, I think the situation in general highlights where South Korea is, and kind of being caught in the middle of this great global competition, tech competition between China and the US. The U.S. last year put export controls on advanced semiconductors and equipment to manufacture them, towards China, and I think China's Micron ban is clearly seen as a response to that. For South Korea, obviously it would represent an opportunity to fill this gap, especially the Micron materials that are being banned are memory chips, which South Korea is a global powerhouse in, with Samsung and SK Hynix, that would seem to be an obvious market opportunity for them to fill the gap. This Bloomberg report, I mean, this is nothing that South Korea has officially announced. This was kind of a on background type of report that said that South Korea has decided not to pursue this opportunity. I mean, there have been other reports that have said different thing, so it's not exactly clear what South Korea is going to do, but you can see the dilemma for them. On the one hand, obviously China is still the biggest market for the export of these semiconductors, which is a huge segment in the South Korean economy. At the same time, South Korea and the U.S. have a lot of aligned interests and are kind of moving closer and closer in many areas, of course, in security and military and other regions. So I think the idea would be that South Korea is maybe looking longer term as far as this particular issue is concerned, and saying, okay, we're going to, prioritize a longer term relationship with the U.S. over this one issue. The question is, China also has the capacity to respond economically, they can certainly use a lot of levers to exert pressure on South Korea. In reverse, so I think, it's we still haven't heard anything concrete, but it's a real almost encapsulates the situation that South Korea finds itself in.
Right, and I suppose time will tell us then. Malay, on the security front, a recent ranking had the South Korean military in 6th place for most powerful for this year, that is. Could you tell us a bit more about Korea's ranking and that of other countries as well?
Yes, so the ranking factors are the amount of military equipment and troops, the financial standing, and the available resources. And Korea was the #1 East Asian country, which can be seen as quite a big accomplishment, right after China, of course. China is #2, but Korea is #6, which is a very, very good position for Korea, taking in consideration that it is not that big of a country compared to other East Asian countries. So Korea was ranking so high due to its aircraft fleet, due to its fighting vehicles, and due to its helicopters. And the highest ranked military power was the United States. #2 was Russia. #3 was China. #4 was India. And #5 was UK. So it is like a really high position that South Korea has. And of course it has something to do with military service in Korea, that all able-bodied men have to serve in the military. It's also interesting to see that Korea came way before Japan, which was ranked as #8, even though Japan has said that it will take up the amount of money that it will spend on military activities.
Right, of course. Thomas, staying with security, South Korean troops and their US counterparts, they've held a large live fire drills near the border with North Korea. This was last week. Now, some pundits claim that such joint military activities, which have been going on under the Yoon administration, may be keeping North Korea from taking on more brazen acts of provocation, if I may. What do you care to add to this?
Well, I think as we saw this morning, North Korea is certainly continuing its provocative acts. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that North Korea has specific goals that it's looking to hit in terms of its nuclear and missile capabilities, that it is just really, Pyongyang is fixated on, I think, attaining these certain levels that would demonstrate its deterrence capabilities, its ability to pose a legitimate threat to South Korea and to the United States, and sort of start, put itself on that level if it's going to, ever return to any sort of negotiations. At the same time, we don't know what they haven't done because of perhaps these shows of force that the U.S. and South Korea have demonstrated. I mean, there are some arguments that perhaps keeping up this level of just intensity in terms of drills does put pressure on North Korea to try to respond and accelerate its programs, while at the same time they're suffering economically. There's food shortages, harvest season is coming up, so will that force them to kind of, perhaps take a step back from their defense expenditures? I mean, there's just a lot of things we don't know about it. I attended that live fire drill, and I think some of it too was just intended as a show to the domestic audience. Certainly the way it was presented there, it was kind of a show. There was music, there were videos, there was a large audience. Some of them were soldiers and parents of soldiers, and I think, it probably riles up and builds up morale for the troops themselves, and is sending a message to the South Korean public. I think that we're taking this seriously, we're taking your defense seriously. And if you talk to military personnel themselves, they do value these joint exercises a lot. I mean, they like to train, and especially in terms of coordinating between U.S. forces and South Korean forces. I don't think anyone would say it's a waste of time, on the sort of fundamental level.
Right, especially keeping in mind North Korea's continued provocations, of course. Right, well, on that note, we'll have to end it there. Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks so much.
And Melanie, thank you very much for your insight today. Right, well, that is all for this session of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow. That is Thursday, so do join us then.